April 29th, 1945, 2:47 p.m., outside Dachau concentration camp, Germany. The smell hit us 3 miles before we saw the gates. I was riding in the lead jeep of the 45th Infantry Division's reconnaissance unit, serving as their German interpreter. 26 years old, born in Brooklyn, to parents who'd fled Berlin in 1933. I spoke fluent German, the real kind, not the textbook variety they taught at Army Language School. My mother had made sure of that, insisting we speak only German at home, despite my father's protests that we were Americans now. We are Americans, she'd say, in her precise Hochdeutsch. But we must never forget what we left behind or why we had to leave. Now I was going back. Not to Berlin, not to the country my parents had known, but to something else entirely. Something that would make me understand why my mother cried sometimes when she thought no one was listening, why my father refused to speak about the family members who'd stayed behind, why they'd given up everything, careers, home, language, culture, to start over in a country that didn't particularly want Jewish refugees. Lieutenant Morrison, sitting beside me in the jeep, saw my face change when the wind shifted. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, pulling his collar up over his nose. "What the hell is that?" I knew what it was. We all did, even if we didn't want to admit it. We'd heard rumors for months, whispers about camps, about systematic killings, about atrocities that seemed too monstrous to believe. Command had dismissed most of it as propaganda, exaggeration, the kind of stories that get inflated in wartime. But that smell wasn't propaganda. That smell was real, and it was getting stronger with every mile, sir, I said quietly. I think we need to prepare the men for what we're about to find. Morrison looked at me. He was a good officer, farm boy from Iowa, led his men through France and Belgium with the kind of steady competence that kept casualties low. But there was nothing in his experience, nothing in anyone's experience, that could prepare us for what waited behind those gates. What do you mean, Rosenberg? I struggled to find words. How do you explain something you've never seen but somehow know with absolute certainty? How do you voice suspicions so dark that speaking them feels like giving them power? The camps, sir. The concentration camps. I don't think they're what we've been told. We've been briefed. Political prisoners, labor camps, rough conditions, but, sir, that smell. That's not a labor camp. That's death. A lot of death. The jeep went quiet. The other soldiers, Sergeant Collins, Private Henderson, Corporal Martinez, all men I'd served with for 8 months, all men I'd translated for during interrogations of German prisoners, during negotiations with French civilians, during the 1,000 small interactions that come with fighting your way across Europe. They trusted my judgment, and they could smell it too. We crested a hill, and there it was. Dachau. The camp spread across the valley below us, rectangular buildings arranged in precise geometric patterns, surrounded by high walls topped with guard towers. From this distance it could have been a factory, a military base, anything industrial and organized. But those bodies, even from half a mile away we could see bodies piled beside the railroad tracks like cordwood. Holy Mother of God, Martinez whispered, crossing himself. Morrison grabbed the radio. Able 6 to command. We have visual on the camp. Requesting orders and requesting medical support. Lots of medical support, the radio crackled. Command to Able 6. Proceed to secure the facility. Medical units are being dispatched. Be advised German guards may still be present. Roger that. Able 6 out. Morrison turned to look at his squad. 15 men in 3 jeeps, armed with rifles and 1 bar, advancing toward a facility none of us understood. His face was pale beneath the dust and stubble. Rosenberg, you're with me on point. Collins, Martinez, Henderson, weapons ready, but hold fire unless fired upon. We don't know what we're walking into. We didn't know. But I was beginning to suspect, and the suspicion was worse than any combat I'd experienced in 8 months of war. The main gates stood open. The guard towers were empty. As we drove closer, I could see that the SS guards had fled, leaving behind, what? Their duties? Their crimes? Their victims? The first person we encountered was an old man, impossibly thin, wearing striped prison uniform that hung on his skeletal frame. He was standing beside the gate, swaying slightly, staring at us with eyes that seemed too large for his face. Morrison stopped the jeep. I climbed out slowly, hands visible, trying not to startle him. "Sprechen Sie Deutsch?" I asked. "Do you speak German?" The man didn't respond, just stared. I tried again in Yiddish, my grandmother's language, learned at her knee during summers in Brooklyn. "Redst du Yiddish? Do you speak Yiddish?" Something flickered in those dead eyes. Recognition. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out at first. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, "Yidden? Jews?" He was asking if we were Jews. "Jo," I said. "Yes. Wir sehnen du zu helfen." "We're here to help." The man collapsed, just folded up and fell. I caught him before he hit the ground, and he weighed nothing, maybe 80 pounds, all bones and loose skin. He was crying, making sounds that weren't quite words, clutching my jacket with hands that felt like bird claws. "Medic," I shouted. "We need a medic here." Henderson ran over with his medical kit, but the man wouldn't let go of me. Just held on, sobbing, repeating the same phrase over and over in Yiddish. "Wir seinen gerade vet." "Wir seinen gerade vet." We are saved. We are saved. I held him while Henderson checked his vitals, while Morrison radioed for medical support, while more prisoners began emerging from the barracks, walking skeletons in striped uniforms, moving slowly, disbelieving, reaching toward us with skeletal hands. "How many?" Morrison asked me. "How many prisoners?" I looked around at the camp, at the barracks stretching away in precise rows, at the faces beginning to appear in windows and doorways. Thousands, sir. Maybe tens of thousands. Jesus Christ. The man in my arms had stopped crying. He pulled back slightly, looked at my face, touched the Star of David I wore on a chain under my uniform. My grandmother's, given to me before I shipped out. "Amerikaner Yid?" "American Jew." "Yes, from Brooklyn." He said something in rapid Yiddish, too fast for me to catch all of it, but I got the essential meaning. Thank God. Thank God you came. Thank God we lived to see this day. "What's your name?" I asked. "Mordechai." "Mordechai Weiss, from Vienna." I was a teacher. "Mathematics." They arrested me in 1938. 7 years. 7 years in this place. 7 years. I tried to imagine it and couldn't. 7 years of whatever had reduced this man to a walking skeleton, whatever had put that emptiness in his eyes. "We need to get you medical attention," I said. "Food, water, we'll take care of you now." "Food?" He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "We forgot what food looks like, what food tastes like. They gave us, I don't know what to call it, brown water. Bread that was mostly sawdust, just enough to keep us alive so we could work." "Work at what?" His laugh became bitter. "At dying slowly. That was our job here, to die slowly enough that they could extract every ounce of labor first. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones," he gestured toward the camp, "the unlucky ones are still here." Morrison was organizing the men, establishing a perimeter, trying to impose some kind of military order on a situation that defied all normal protocols. But I couldn't look away from Mordechai's face, from the evidence of systematic cruelty that I was seeing for the first time, but that my parents had feared for 12 years. "Your family?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Gone. My wife, my daughters. Auschwitz, I heard, but I'm not sure. They separated us at Theresienstadt. That was 3 years ago. I don't know. I'll never know." The weight of those words settled over me. His family gone into the machinery of genocide, while he'd been kept alive to teach mathematics in a concentration camp, to die slowly while being useful. More soldiers were arriving now, full companies, medics, officers trying to assess the situation. Colonel Fellens, commanding the 157th Infantry Regiment, pulled up in a command vehicle and immediately started issuing orders. But he stopped mid-sentence when he saw the prisoners, when the reality of what we'd found hit him. "Rosenberg," he called, "I need you. I need someone who speaks German to help us figure out what the hell this place is." I helped Mordechai over to a medic, promised I'd find him later, and reported to the colonel. "Sir." "Rosenberg, you speak German, right? Native level?" "Yes, sir. My parents were German Jews, emigrated in '33. He looked at me differently then, understanding something. "Then you know what we're seeing here." "I'm beginning to understand, sir. I need you to help coordinate. We've got thousands of prisoners, most of them in terrible condition. We need to figure out who needs immediate medical attention, who can communicate with us what the hell has been happening here. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir. What I didn't say was that I wasn't sure I could do that. Wasn't sure I could maintain the professional detachment necessary to function as a soldier and interpreter, when everything I was seeing was personal, was about my family, was about what could have happened to my parents if they hadn't gotten out in time. But I was the only one in the unit who spoke fluent German and Yiddish, who could communicate with both the German civilians we'd need to interrogate and the Jewish prisoners who made up most of the camp population. So I didn't have a choice. The next 6 hours existed in a kind of horrific blur. We found the barracks first. Long wooden buildings designed to hold maybe 200 people, packed with over 1,000 each. The prisoners slept on wooden shelves, stacked 3 high, with barely enough room to turn over. The smell inside was indescribable. Unwashed bodies, disease, death, human waste. Many of the prisoners were too weak to move, lying in their own filth, dying of typhus or dysentery or simple starvation. I moved through the barracks with medical teams, translating, trying to assess who needed immediate evacuation. But there were too many. Thousands of people in desperate need of medical care, and we had maybe 50 medics. In the 3rd barracks, I found a woman who spoke perfect German. She'd been a doctor in Berlin before the war. "I can help," she said. "I've been treating prisoners with whatever I could find. Let me help your medics." Her name was Dr. Ruth Fischer. She weighed maybe 70 pounds and could barely stand, but her eyes were sharp, professional, alive in a way that most of the other prisoners weren't. "What do they need to know?" she asked. "Your medics. What do they need to know about treating us?" "Everything. They've never seen anything like this. None of us had seen anything like this. That's the point. This is new. This is unprecedented. This is what happens when human beings are systematically stripped of their humanity." She spent the next hour briefing our medics, explaining the medical conditions they'd encounter: advanced starvation, typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, infections from forced labor, injuries from beatings. She explained refeeding syndrome, how giving starving people too much food too quickly could kill them. She explained the psychological trauma, the dissociation, the survivors who'd simply stopped caring whether they lived or died. "The worst cases aren't physical," she said. "They're the ones who've given up, who've decided that surviving one more day isn't worth the effort. You'll know them because they're the ones who don't react when you tell them they're free. They can't believe it, can't process it. Freedom is a concept that stopped having meaning years ago." While the medics worked, I was pulled away to help interrogate captured SS guards. We'd found about 30 of them hiding in the camp, too cowardly to flee but too craven to face what they'd done. The interrogation room, really just a camp office we'd commandeered, smelled of stale sweat and fear. The SS guard sitting across from me was maybe 25, blonde, fit. Everything the Nazi propaganda machine had claimed represented Aryan superiority. His uniform was crisp, his boots polished. He looked nothing like the walking skeletons I'd been helping all day. "Name and rank," Colonel Winters demanded. He was heading the interrogation, with me translating. I repeated the question in German. The guard stared at me with blue eyes that showed no emotion, no remorse, nothing. Unterscharführer Hans Müller, he finally said, "How long have you been stationed here?" 2 years. What was your duty? Guard duty. Supervising work details. Supervising work details, I translated, keeping my voice neutral, even though I wanted to scream. Colonel, he's being deliberately vague. Push him. Ask him what happened to the prisoners. Why so many are dead? I leaned forward, making eye contact with Miller. In German, I said, "There are piles of bodies outside. Railroad cars full of corpses. Thousands of people barely alive." "What happened here?" He shrugged, like we were discussing the weather, like the systematic murder of human beings was just another administrative detail. They were weak. They died. It happens. It happens? Thousands of people don't just die. This was deliberate. This was murder. I was following orders. The Jews, the political prisoners, the criminals, they were enemies of the Reich. My duty was to guard them, to ensure they fulfilled their labor obligations. What happened to them afterward was not my concern. Something snapped inside me. All day I'd been maintaining professional distance, playing my role as interpreter and soldier. But hearing this man, this murderer in a crisp uniform, describe genocide as following orders, as fulfilling labor obligations, as not his concern. I stood up, fists clenched, and started toward him. Colonel Winters grabbed my arm. "Rosenberg, stand down." "Sir, this man, I know what he is. I know what he's done. But we need information, and we need it through proper channels." "Control yourself, Sergeant." I forced myself to sit down, forced myself to breathe, forced myself to remember that I was an American soldier, that we had laws, that we weren't like them. But God, it was hard. The interrogation continued for 2 more hours. Miller gave us nothing useful, just repeated denials, claims of following orders, assertions that he was just doing his duty. Other guards said similar things. They were cogs in a machine. They didn't make policy. They just followed orders. The banality of it was almost worse than active malice. These weren't fanatics. They weren't ideologues. They were ordinary men who'd participated in extraordinary evil because it was their job, because everyone else was doing it, because questioning orders wasn't their role. By evening, more units had arrived. Field hospitals were being set up. Food was being prepared, carefully portioned to avoid refeeding syndrome. Water was being distributed. Medical teams were triaging thousands of prisoners, trying to save who they could save. I found Mordechai again in the makeshift hospital. He was in a bed, a real bed with clean sheets, receiving intravenous fluids. His eyes found mine, and he smiled weakly. "The American Jew from Brooklyn," he said. "I thought maybe I'd dreamed you." "No dream. You're safe now. You're going to recover." Recover. He tested the word like it was foreign. "I don't know if that's possible. The body can recover, yes, but the mind? The soul? After 7 years of this?" I pulled up a chair beside his bed. "Tell me about your family. Before the war. Tell me about your daughters." His eyes filled with tears, but he started talking. About Sarah and Rebecca, 8 and 6, when he'd last seen them. About his wife Hannah, who'd been a pianist, who'd played Beethoven and Brahms in their apartment in Vienna. About normal life, teaching mathematics, walking in the park, eating dinner together, all the ordinary things that had been stolen from them. "I taught them mathematics," he said. Sarah was brilliant. She could do calculus in her head at 10 years old. I used to imagine her becoming a professor, maybe at the university. Rebecca was more artistic, like her mother, but both smart, both beautiful. "Both gone now?" "You don't know that for certain." "I know." His voice was flat, certain. "I know because I've been here 7 years. I've seen what happens. I've watched them select people for the transports east. I've heard the rumors about the camps in Poland. I know, even if I don't want to know." We sat in silence for a while. Around us, medics moved between beds, administering care, trying to undo years of systematic starvation and brutality with antibiotics and IV fluids? Why you? I finally asked. Why did they keep you here when they sent your family away? I was useful. I could teach mathematics to the children of SS officers. The commandant's son needed tutoring, so I lived while others died. I survived because I could teach calculus to the son of the man who was murdering my people. The bitter irony of it was crushing. Survival through collaboration, through being useful to your oppressors, through teaching the mathematics of ballistics and logistics to the children of men implementing genocide. That's not your fault, I said, isn't it? I could have refused, could have let them kill me. Instead, I chose to live day after day, teaching equations while my family died in Auschwitz. Survival isn't a choice. It's not something to feel guilty about. Tell me that in 7 years when you've had time to think about everything you did to survive. Tell me then if you still believe that. I didn't have an answer. Couldn't imagine what I would have done in his place. Would I have taught mathematics to Nazi children to stay alive? Would I have collaborated, even passively, if it meant one more day of life? The question was moot. My parents had gotten out, had fled Germany in 1933 when Hitler first came to power, when they'd seen what was coming, even though most of their friends had dismissed their fears as paranoid. They'd given up everything, my father's medical practice, my mother's teaching position, their home, their language, their culture, to start over in America. And now I understood why. Now I saw what staying would have meant. Over the next 3 days, the full scope of Dachau revealed itself. We found the crematorium, industrial ovens designed for burning bodies, still containing remains when we arrived. We found the gas chamber disguised as a shower room that prisoners said had been used for executions, though Nazi records claimed it was never operational. We found medical experimentation records, documents detailing hypothermia experiments, high-altitude experiments, malaria experiments, all conducted on prisoners without consent or anesthesia. We found mass graves, railroad cars full of bodies, prisoners who died in the final days before liberation. Their corpses left where they fell. We found 32,000 survivors in various states of health, from those who could walk to those who were hours from death. And we found evidence, meticulous German record-keeping that documented every arrival, every death, every transfer. The Nazis had documented their crimes with bureaucratic precision, never imagining that these records would become evidence in war crimes trials. My role shifted from interpreter to documentarian. Colonel Winters assigned me to work with the Judge Advocate General's office, helping to compile evidence for the future trials. I spent days translating documents, taking statements from survivors, recording testimony from the SS guards we'd captured. Each document was another piece of evidence. Each testimony was another story of systematic cruelty, and each story made it harder to maintain the professional distance I needed to function. On the 4th day, we found the children's barracks. I'd thought nothing could be worse than what I'd already seen. I was wrong. There were 280 children in Dachau when we liberated it, ages ranging from infants to teenagers. Some were with their mothers, but most were orphans, their parents murdered in other camps or in the chaos of the final months of the war. The children were different from the adults. The adults had a kind of deadness in their eyes, a dissociation that came from years of trauma. But the children, some of them still had hope, still believed that rescue meant safety, that liberation meant a return to normalcy. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, approached me in the children's section. She was tiny, malnourished, with huge dark eyes and hair that had been shaved months ago and was growing back in patches. She didn't speak at first, just stood there, looking up at me in my American uniform with the Star of David chain visible at my collar. "Bist du a Malach?" she finally asked in Yiddish. "Are you an angel?" The question broke something in me that I'd been carefully holding together for 4 days. No, sweetheart. I'm just a soldier. What's your name? Sarah, the same name as Mordechai's daughter. Are you here to take me to my mama? God help me. Where is your mama, Sarah? They took her away. The men in the black uniforms. They said she had to go work in the factory. But that was a long time ago. She said she'd come back, but she didn't come back. Are you going to help me find her? I knelt down so we were eye level. I'm going to help you, yes. We're all going to help you. You're safe now. Safe? She tested the word like she didn't quite understand it. What does safe mean? A 6-year-old child asking what safety meant because she'd never experienced it. That's what Dachau was. That's what the Nazis had created. I spent the next 2 hours in the children's section, translating for the medical teams, trying to assess which children needed immediate care. Many had tuberculosis, most were severely malnourished. All were traumatized to degrees that I couldn't begin to comprehend. Dr. Fischer, the former Berlin physician I'd met on the first day, was helping to organize care for the children. She'd recovered somewhat with food and medical attention, though she still looked like a strong wind could knock her over. The children are the hardest, she said, watching me work. The adults understand, or think they understand, what happened to them. The children just know that the world became a nightmare and they don't know why. How do you help them? I don't know. I'm a doctor. I can treat their bodies, but their minds. Their souls? That's beyond my training. That might be beyond anyone's capacity to heal. That night I wrote my first letter home since arriving at Dachau. I tried to describe what I'd seen, tried to find words for the systematic horror. Tried to explain to my parents why they'd been right to flee, why their paranoia hadn't been paranoia at all, but terrifyingly accurate foresight. But the words wouldn't come. How do you describe hell to people living in safety? How do you explain that the world contains evil on a scale that defies human comprehension? I ended up writing something simple. Mom, Dad, I understand now why you left. I understand why you were afraid. You were right. You saved our family. I love you. On the 5th day, they brought in German civilians from the nearby town. General Eisenhower had ordered that civilians from communities near concentration camps be forced to tour the facilities, to see what had been done in their name with their silent complicity. I was assigned to translate for one of these tours. 50 civilians from Dachau town marched through the camp they claimed to know nothing about, forced to witness the evidence of crimes they'd denied. They walked through the barracks. They saw the prisoners. They saw the crematorium. They saw the piles of bodies. And they claimed they didn't know, claimed they had had no idea, claimed this was impossible, must be propaganda, couldn't be real. One woman, well-dressed, probably in her 50s, stopped in front of the crematorium and turned to me. "This is American propaganda," she said in German. "You did this. You created this scene to make us look bad. The Führer would never—" I cut her off. In German I said, "Madam, I've been here 5 days. I've translated the testimony of hundreds of survivors. I've read the Nazi documents that record every death. I've held children who've forgotten what safety feels like. Don't tell me this is propaganda, but we didn't know." How could we know? This camp was closed. Secret, they didn't tell us. "You knew." My voice was harder than I'd intended. "You saw the prisoners on work details. You saw the smoke from the crematorium. You saw your Jewish neighbors disappear. You knew and you did nothing, and now you want to claim ignorance." She started crying. Most of them did. Whether from genuine remorse or simply from being forced to confront their complicity, I couldn't tell. Maybe it didn't matter. But there was one man, older, maybe 60, wearing a worn suit, who didn't cry, who walked through the camp with a kind of grim determination. At the end of the tour, he approached me. "You speak German well," he said. "Where did you learn?" "From my parents. They were German Jews. They left in 1933. He nodded slowly. "They were wise. My brother was not. He was arrested in 38, Kristallnacht. I never saw him again. I tried to help, tried to find him, but he gestured at the camp. Now I know where he ended up. One of these piles of bodies, probably. Why didn't you leave? I wasn't Jewish. I was just a teacher. I thought I'd be safe. I thought if I kept my head down, if I didn't make trouble, if I pretended not to see, I thought I'd be safe. He laughed bitterly. And I was. I survived while my brother died. I'm safe, and he's ashes. That's my reward for cowardice. Over the next week, more units arrived. More medical personnel. More supplies. The survivors were slowly being stabilized, though dozens died each day despite our best efforts, too damaged by years of starvation and disease to recover, even with modern medical care. I continued working as an interpreter, documenting evidence, recording testimony. Each day brought new horrors, new stories, new evidence of systematic evil. On the 10th day, I was called to translate for a special case. A woman claiming to be a former guard was offering testimony in exchange for protection. Her name was Hilda Schmidt. She was 32 years old, had worked at Dachau for 18 months as a female guard overseeing work details. Unlike most of the SS personnel we'd captured, she was willing to talk, willing to explain how the system worked. They trained us, she said. Weeks of training about why this was necessary. About how the prisoners were threats to Germany, how they'd destroy our country if given the chance. About how this wasn't cruelty but necessity. And you believe that? At first. Then you see what happens day after day, and you realize it's not about security or necessity. It's about cruelty for its own sake. It's about power and domination and the pleasure some people take in having absolute control over others. Why didn't you stop? Why didn't you refuse? Refuse? She laughed. You don't refuse the SS. You do your job or you become a prisoner yourself. I had a choice, participate or die. I chose to live. Maybe that makes me a monster. Maybe I should have chosen death. But I didn't. I translated her testimony for hours. She described the command structure, the policies, the procedures, described how prisoners were selected for transport east, how the medical experiments were authorized, how the crematorium operated. She described it all in a flat, emotionless voice, as if recounting a factory process rather than mass murder. Do you feel guilt? I asked, going off script. She looked at me, really looked at me for the first time. What do you think? I helped murder thousands of people. I watched children starve. I beat women for the crime of being too weak to work. Do I feel guilt? Every moment of every day. Does that change what I did? No. Does it matter? No. I'm a monster, whether I feel guilty about it or not. The honesty was almost refreshing after days of SS guards claiming they'd just followed orders, that they hadn't known, that they weren't responsible. On the 15th day, something unexpected happened. One of the survivors, a man I'd helped translate for during the initial liberation, asked if he could attend the interrogation. Of the SS guards, his name was Jakob Stein. He'd been a lawyer in Munich before the war, arrested in 1940 for being Jewish and politically active. 5 years in Dachau had reduced him to 80 pounds of bone and determination. Colonel Winters agreed, though he pulled me aside first. Rosenberg, this could get complicated. Keep things professional. If Stein gets emotional, get him out of there. Understood? Yes, sir. We brought in an SS guard named Oscar Weber. He'd been a block leader, responsible for discipline in one of the barracks sections. Multiple survivors had identified him as particularly brutal. Jakob sat in the corner, almost invisible, just watching. The interrogation began normally, name, rank, duties. Weber gave the standard responses, following orders, didn't make policy, just doing his job. Then Jakob spoke. In German, quiet but clear, "You killed my brother." Weber's eyes snapped to Jakob, seeing him for the first time. Recognition dawned on his face. He knew Jakob, remembered him. "Your brother was weak," Weber said. "He couldn't handle the work." "That's not my fault. He was 14 years old. You beat him to death because he stole a piece of bread. He stole. There are consequences for theft. He was starving. You fed us barely enough to survive, worked us until we collapsed, and then punished us for trying to stay alive. Jakob stood up, walked slowly toward Weber. I tensed, ready to intervene, but Jacob just stood there, looking at the man who'd murdered his brother. I want you to understand something, Jacob said. You think you were following orders. You think that absolves you. But you had choices. Every day you chose cruelty. You chose to beat a 14-year-old boy to death rather than look the other way while he ate a piece of bread. That's not following orders. That's choosing evil. Weber said nothing. Just stared at the floor. You're going to be tried, Jacob continued. You're going to be convicted. You're going to hang. And when you do, I hope you remember my brother's face. I hope you remember every person you hurt. I hope it haunts you until the rope drops. Then Jakob turned and walked out. Professional, controlled, dignified in a way that Weber would never understand. After he left, I continued the interrogation. But Weber was different now, quieter, less defiant. Jakob's words had cut through his defenses in a way that official interrogation never could. By the end of April, the immediate crisis at Dachau was stabilizing. Survivors were receiving proper medical care. Field hospitals had been established. The dead were being buried with dignity. War crimes investigators were compiling evidence, and I was being reassigned. Rosenberg, Colonel Winters said. We need you in Nuremberg. They're setting up the War Crimes Tribunal, and they need German interpreters who understand what happened in these camps. You've been here from the beginning. You've documented more testimony than anyone. You're the logical choice. When do I leave? 3 days. Pack your things. Say your goodbyes. I spent those 3 days visiting the people I'd met during liberation. Dr. Fischer was recovering well, had been offered a position helping to coordinate long-term medical care for survivors. Mordechai was stronger, was beginning to think about what came next, where he'd go now that Vienna was no longer home. Jakob Stein was planning to testify at the trials. I want the world to hear what happened here, he said. I want my brother's death to mean something. And little Sarah, the 6-year-old who'd asked if I was an angel, she was with a relief organization that was working to place orphaned children with families. They'd found relatives of hers in Palestine, an aunt who'd emigrated before the war. Sarah would go there, would grow up in a Jewish homeland, would maybe forget the horrors of Dachau. Maybe? Are you leaving? She asked when I came to say goodbye. Yes, I have to work somewhere else now. Will you come back? I don't know, Sarah, but you're going somewhere safe. You're going to live with your aunt, and she's going to take care of you. Will she love me like my mama loved me? God, the questions children asked. Yes, I think she will. Sarah hugged me the first time she'd willingly touched anyone since I'd met her. She weighed nothing, this tiny child who'd survived hell through no merit or choice of her own. Thank you for helping me find safe, she whispered. I think I'm starting to remember what it means. I left Dachau on May the 2nd, 1945. As we drove away, I looked back at the camp one last time. It looked different now, American flags flying, medical tents everywhere, survivors walking around freely. Liberation had transformed it, but I knew the transformation was only physical. The psychological scars, the spiritual damage, the trauma of what had happened there, that would persist long after the physical evidence was cleaned up. I spent the next 7 months in Nuremberg, working as an interpreter for the International Military Tribunal. I translated testimony from survivors. I helped present documentary evidence. I watched as the architects of genocide were brought to justice. It was necessary work, important work. But it didn't undo what had happened. It didn't bring back Mordechai's family or Sarah's mother or Jacob's 14-year-old brother. It just established, for the historical record, that these crimes had occurred and that someone would be held accountable. The trials themselves were surreal, listening to men in suits discuss genocide using bureaucratic language, presenting evidence of industrial-scale murder through statistical analyses and organizational charts. The horror became abstract, reduced to numbers and administrative procedures, but sometimes the abstraction would crack and the reality would break through. On November 29, 1945, I was translating testimony from a Dachau survivor named Samuel Rothman. He was describing the medical experiments, how prisoners had been subjected to hypothermia trials, how Nazi doctors had frozen men nearly to death to test rewarming procedures for Luftwaffe pilots downed in the North Sea. Hermann Göring, sitting in the defendant's dock in his cleaned gray uniform, was smirking. Actually smirking, as if this testimony was somehow amusing or exaggerated. Samuel saw it, stopped mid-sentence, stared directly at Göring. "You think this is funny?" he asked in German. "You think what they did to us is a joke?" The court erupted, judges calling for order, defense attorneys objecting. But Samuel kept talking, his voice rising. "They put us in ice water for hours. Some men died immediately. Some went mad from the pain. They timed how long we could survive. They took notes. They documented everything. And you sit there smirking like this is theater, like these were acceptable military experiments rather than torture." I translated every word, my voice shaking. Samuel was breaking protocol, was supposed to stick to answering questions, but no one tried to stop him. The truth in his words, the raw emotion, was more powerful than any procedural rule. "I want you to understand something," Samuel continued, pointing at the defendants. "You ordered this. You authorized it. You built the system that allowed it to happen. And now you sit in comfortable chairs, eating regular meals, sleeping in beds, while the men you tortured are still waking up screaming from nightmares. That's not justice. It's an insult." The judges let him speak for 5 more minutes. Let him detail the experiments, the cruelty, the casual brutality of men in white coats treating human beings as laboratory animals. When he finished, the courtroom was silent. Göring wasn't smirking anymore. That night, I found Samuel in the witness housing area. He was sitting alone, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands. "I shouldn't have lost control," he said. "I know I was supposed to be professional, just answer questions. But seeing him smirk, you said what needed saying. You reminded everyone that these aren't just legal proceedings. They're about real people, real suffering. Will it matter? Will any of this matter? They'll be convicted, yes. Some will hang. But does that change what happened? Does it undo the damage? No, but it establishes truth. It creates a record that can't be denied or revised. 50 years from now, 100 years from now, people will be able to point to these trials and say, this happened, and it was evil, and the world said so." And that's enough? Historical acknowledgement? It has to be. It's all we have. The trials continued through October 1946, 12 death sentences, 7 prison terms, 3 acquittals that made my stomach turn. Justice of a sort, though it felt inadequate to the scale of the crimes. I returned to the United States in November 1946, discharged from the Army with an honorable record, commendations for my work at Dachau and Nuremberg, and trauma that I didn't have words to describe. My parents met me at the dock in New York. My mother took one look at my face and knew. She didn't ask questions, didn't press for details, just held me while I cried for the first time since Liberation Day at Dachau. "You saw it?" she said quietly. "You saw what we fled from?" "Yes. And now you understand why we left everything behind. Why we were willing to be poor immigrants rather than stay in a country that hated us. I understand. I'm sorry I ever questioned it. I'm sorry I ever thought you were overreacting. My father, who rarely showed emotion, put his hand on my shoulder. "You did important work, David. You helped survivors. You helped bring criminals to justice. That matters, does it? Does it matter when millions are dead? Yes, because their deaths would be meaningless if no one bore witness, if no one spoke for them, if the world was allowed to forget or deny what happened. You were a witness. That's sacred work." I wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that translating testimony and documenting crimes and helping convict war criminals was meaningful, was worth something. But part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I'd arrived too late, that if I'd been faster, smarter, better, maybe I could have saved more people. The survivor's guilt hit hard in those first months home. I'd seen hell and walked away, had returned to comfort while people like Mordechai and Sarah and Jacob were still struggling with the aftermath, still dealing with trauma and loss and the impossibility of rebuilding lives from ashes. I enrolled at Columbia University using the GI Bill, studying international law with the vague idea that maybe I could help prevent future atrocities. Met a woman named Rebecca at a Jewish student organization meeting, daughter of Polish immigrants studying social work. We talked for hours that first night about the war, about what came next, about how to live in a world that had revealed itself capable of such systematic evil. "My family didn't get out," she said. "My grandparents, my aunts and uncles, my cousins, they stayed in Warsaw. I don't know exactly what happened to them, but I know they're gone. And I'm here, safe. And I don't know how to reconcile that. I don't think we can reconcile it. I think we just have to carry it and try to build something meaningful from the weight." We married in 1948, built a life together, had 3 children, created a family that existed because our parents had been wise enough or lucky enough to escape. But the war never really left us. It lived in the nightmares I still had, in the way Rebecca would sometimes cry when lighting Shabbat candles, thinking about the grandmother who'd taught her the prayers but hadn't survived to see her married. In 1957, I received a letter from Germany. The return address was Munich, and the name on the envelope was Dr. Ruth Fischer. She'd survived, had rebuilt her medical career, was now working at a hospital specializing in treating Holocaust survivors. She'd tracked me down through old Army records, wanted me to know that many of the people I'd helped at Dachau were alive, were rebuilding. Mordechai Weiss had immigrated to Israel, was teaching mathematics at a university in Tel Aviv. He'd never remarried, never had more children, but he'd found purpose in teaching a new generation. Jakob Stein had become a prosecutor in the West German government, was working to bring Nazi war criminals to justice in German courts. Little Sarah was 20 now, living on a kibbutz in Israel, studying to be a teacher. She'd asked Dr. Fischer to tell me that she still remembered the American soldier who'd helped her find safe, that she'd named her first daughter Ruth after Dr. Fischer and would name her second daughter, when she had one, Sarah, after her mother. The letter ended with an invitation. "If you ever find yourself in Germany, please visit. Many of us would like to thank you properly for what you did. I never made that trip. Couldn't bring myself to return to Germany, to walk streets where my parents had once lived, to see the country that had tried to murder my people." Maybe that was cowardice. Maybe it was self-preservation. I didn't know, but I wrote back to Dr. Fischer, told her I was proud of the work she was doing, grateful that so many had survived, honored to have played even a small role in their liberation. And I asked her to pass a message to Sarah. "You taught me what safe means, too." "Thank you. The decades passed. I taught international law at Columbia for 30 years, wrote books about the Nuremberg trials, about the legal frameworks established to prosecute genocide, testified before Congress about the importance of maintaining Holocaust memory, raised children and then grandchildren who grew up in a world where the Holocaust was history rather than lived experience. But I never forgot. Couldn't forget the smell of Dachau, the sound of Mordechai weeping in my arms, the sight of Sarah's face when she asked if I was an angel, the weight of translating testimony from survivors, carrying their words from German or Yiddish into English so the world could understand what had been done to them. In 1985, I was invited to speak at a Holocaust Remembrance ceremony at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. I was 76 years old, my hair white, my hands shaking slightly with age or emotion, or both. I stood at the podium and looked out at the audience, survivors, their children and grandchildren, students who'd been born decades after the war ended. And I tried to find words for what I'd witnessed 40 years earlier. I was the interpreter, I began. I translated their testimony, carried their words from one language to another so the world could understand. But some things can't be translated. Some experiences exist beyond language. The systematic destruction of human dignity, the industrial-scale murder, the casual cruelty of ordinary people participating in extraordinary evil. These things can be described, but they can't truly be conveyed. You have to see them, smell them, feel them to understand. I hope you never understand. I hope no generation ever has to understand what I understood at Dachau. But I fear that evil doesn't die, doesn't learn lessons, doesn't stop simply because we've said never again. So I'm asking you, all of you, to be witnesses to the witnesses, to carry forward the testimony, to remember not just that the Holocaust happened, but why it happened, how it happened, and what allowed it to happen. It happened because ordinary people made choices, chose to hate, chose to participate, chose to look away, chose personal safety over moral courage. The guards at Dachau weren't monsters from nightmares. They were regular men who chose to do monstrous things, and it was stopped because ordinary people made different choices, chose to risk, chose to care, chose to say this is wrong, even when it was dangerous. The survivors at Dachau lived because they chose to hope, to resist, to believe that liberation might come even when belief seemed insane. We all face those choices every day in smaller ways. Choices about how we treat others. Choices about whether we speak up against injustice or stay silent. Choices about whether we see other humans as fully human or as somehow less than. Choose wisely. Choose compassion. Choose courage. Because the alternative leads to places like Dachau. After the speech, a young woman approached me. She was in her 20s, student at Georgetown, studying Holocaust history. Professor Rosenberg, I have a question. How did you maintain hope? After seeing what you saw, how did you not lose faith in humanity? It was a question I'd been asked many times, and I still didn't have a good answer. I didn't maintain hope, I said honestly. I lost it completely. Standing at Dachau, seeing what humans could do to each other, I lost all faith in humanity's basic goodness. But then I saw the survivors. Saw people who'd endured hell choosing to rebuild. Saw Mordechai deciding to teach again, to pass knowledge to a new generation. Saw Dr. Fischer dedicating her life to healing others. Saw Sarah choosing hope despite having every reason to despair. They taught me something crucial. Humans are capable of extraordinary evil, yes. But we're also capable of extraordinary resilience, extraordinary grace, extraordinary courage. Both capacities exist in every society, every community, every person. The question isn't whether evil exists, it does. The question is which capacity we choose to nurture, which we choose to act on, which we choose to pass to the next generation. The young woman nodded slowly. So hope isn't something you maintain. It's something you choose repeatedly, despite the evidence against it. Exactly. Hope is an act of defiance against despair. It's saying, I've seen the worst of humanity, and I still believe we can be better. It's not naive optimism. It's deliberate, conscious, courageous choice. That night, back in my hotel room, I thought about that conversation. about hope as defiance, about choosing to believe in human potential despite having witnessed human depravity. And I thought about the people I'd met at Dachau, about where they were now, what they'd built from the ashes of their destroyed lives, about how their resilience had taught me that survival itself was resistance, that rebuilding was victory, that choosing life after witnessing death was the ultimate act of courage. I wrote letters that night to Dr. Fischer in Munich, thanking her for the work she continued doing, to Jakob Stein, now a retired prosecutor living in Frankfurt, expressing admiration for his decades of pursuing justice, to Sarah, now Sarah Goldstein, living in Haifa with her family, telling her that I'd spoken about her at the museum, about how a 6-year-old's question about safety had helped me understand what liberation meant. I didn't know if the letters would reach them, didn't know if they'd remember me after 40 years. But I needed to write them, needed to close circles that had been open since 1945, needed to say things I should have said decades earlier. Sarah wrote back 3 months later. Her English was excellent, touched with British phrasing from having learned it in Israel's English language schools. Professor Rosenberg, or should I say David, since we're old friends, I received your letter with joy and tears. Of course I remember you. You were the first American I met, the first person who showed me that the nightmare was over. I want you to know what happened after you left. The relief workers were kind, but I didn't understand where I was going or why. Palestine seemed impossibly far away, and Aunt Miriam was a stranger. I was terrified. But on the ship to Haifa, there were other children, other orphans. And we created a family from our shared loss. We didn't talk about what had happened. Couldn't, really, didn't have words for it. But we understood each other in ways that people who hadn't been there never could. Aunt Miriam was wonderful, patient. She let me grieve in my own time, didn't push me to talk before I was ready. She taught me Hebrew, introduced me to other survivors, helped me build a life in a country that was building itself from refugees and hope. I became a teacher, like my mother had been. I teach kindergarten now, 5- and 6-year-olds, the age I was when you found me. I see myself in every frightened child who comes to class for the first time. I try to show them what you showed me, that safety exists, that kindness exists, that the world can be gentle. I named my daughters Ruth and Hannah, Ruth for Dr. Fischer, who saved my body, Hannah for my mother, who I'll never forget. They're teenagers now, growing up in a country that exists, because people like us refuse to accept that we had no home. Thank you for remembering me. Thank you for speaking about what happened. Thank you for being the person who helped a 6-year-old understand what safe meant. With love and gratitude, Sarah Goldstein. I read that letter a dozen times, cried over it, shared it with Rebecca, kept it in my desk drawer where I could read it when the memories became too heavy, because sometimes the weight of witnessing felt crushing. The nightmares never fully stopped. I'd still wake up smelling Dachau, still see the faces of prisoners I couldn't save, still hear the testimony I'd translated about experiments and torture and systematic murder. But Sarah's letter reminded me of something crucial. Witnessing wasn't just about carrying the burden of what had been lost. It was also about honoring what had survived, about recognizing that Sarah and Mordechai and Dr. Fischer and thousands of others had taken their trauma and built lives anyway, had chosen hope despite having every reason for despair. That was the real victory, not the trials or convictions or historical justice, important as those were. The real victory was that they'd survived, had rebuilt, had created families and careers and meaning from ashes. In 1995, for the 50th anniversary of Dachau's liberation, I finally returned to Germany. I was 86 years old, unsure if I'd survive the trip, but knowing I needed to see it one more time. The camp was a memorial now. clean, organized, educational. They'd preserved some of the original barracks, had created a museum documenting the camp's history. Groups of German students toured through, learning about what had been done in their grandparents' names. I walked through the grounds with Rebecca beside me, trying to reconcile my memories with this sanitized memorial. The smell was gone. The urgency was gone. It was history now, preserved behind glass and plaques. A young German guide approached us. She was maybe 25, earnest, clearly dedicated to the memorial's educational mission. "Excuse me, sir. Are you a survivor? We have a program where survivors can share their stories with students." "I'm not a survivor. I was a liberator. American Army, 45th Infantry Division. I was here on April 29th, 1945, her eyes widened. Oh, we'd be honored if you'd speak with our student groups. They need to hear from people who were actually here. So I spoke to a room full of German teenagers who'd been born 50 years after the war ended, who knew about the Holocaust academically but didn't feel connected to it personally, who sometimes wondered why they should care about events that happened before their grandparents were born. I told them about arriving at Dachau, about Mordechai and Sarah and Dr. Fischer, about the SS guards who claimed they were just following orders, about the townspeople who claimed they didn't know. "I'm not here to make you feel guilty," I said. "You didn't do this. Your generation is innocent of these crimes, but you have a responsibility, not guilt, but responsibility. The responsibility to remember, to understand, to ensure this never happens again. Because the systems that enabled this still exist. The human capacity for cruelty still exists. The ability to dehumanize others, to justify atrocity, to participate in evil while claiming you're just following orders, all of that still exists. Your responsibility is to recognize those patterns when they emerge, to stand against them, to say no when your society asks you to participate in injustice. That's how you honor the victims, not through guilt, but through moral courage." After the talk, a young man approached me. He was crying. "My grandfather," he said. "My grandfather was SS. He worked at Mauthausen concentration camp. We found out after he died, found his records in the attic. My family. We didn't know how to process it. He was a normal grandfather. Told jokes, gave me candy, seemed kind. But he did these things. How do I reconcile that?" It was the question that had haunted me for 50 years. "You can't reconcile it," I said. "You have to hold two truths simultaneously. Your grandfather was kind to you, and your grandfather participated in genocide. Both are true. Both are real. The lesson isn't that all evil people are obviously monsters. It's that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary evil under the right circumstances. Your responsibility isn't to defend him or to hate him. It's to understand how someone like him, normal, ordinary, maybe even kind in personal relationships, could participate in systematic murder, and then to ensure you never make similar choices no matter what society asks of you." The young man nodded, still crying. "Thank you. That helps, I think." That evening, I met with other liberators who'd returned for the anniversary, men I'd served with, men who'd shared those first horrific hours at Dachau. We were old now, in our 80s, but the bond remained. Lieutenant Morrison, now a retired farmer from Iowa, had brought photographs from Liberation Day. We looked at them together, images we'd seen 1,000 times, but that still hit with visceral force. "I still dream about it," Morrison said. "The smell, the prisoners, the bodies. 50 years, and it's still like yesterday. Do you wish you could forget?" I asked, sometimes. But then I think if we forget, who remembers them? Who bears witness? We're the last generation who was actually there. When we're gone, it becomes abstract history. So maybe the nightmares are the price of remembering. Maybe we're supposed to carry this heavy burden to carry for 50 years. Yeah, but someone has to. On our last day in Germany, Rebecca and I visited the memorial wall where names of victims were inscribed. We looked for her family members, found some, but not all. The Nazis had been thorough in their documentation, but not perfect. Some victims existed only in memory, their names lost to history. They're not really here, Rebecca said, touching the stone wall. These names, they're symbols. The people themselves are gone, but maybe that's enough. Maybe having a place to come, a place to remember, maybe that matters. It matters, I said. It has to matter. We left Germany the next day. I never returned. That final visit had been necessary, confronting memory, seeing how the next generation was grappling with history, speaking truth to students who needed to hear it. But once was enough. I spent my final years teaching, writing, speaking at Holocaust remembrance events, trying to pass forward the testimony to ensure that the stories I'd translated and documented wouldn't die with my generation. Rebecca passed in 2003, after 55 years of marriage. Her final words to me were in Yiddish, the language her grandmother had taught her. Gedenk. Farges nicht. Remember, don't forget. I didn't forget. Couldn't forget. Wouldn't forget. I died in 2009 at 99 years old, having outlived most of my generation. My children and grandchildren surrounded my hospital bed. 3 generations that existed because my parents had fled Germany, because I'd survived the war, because we'd chosen to build life from the ashes of near destruction. My last coherent words, according to my daughter, were about Dachau, about the liberation, about a 6-year-old girl asking if I was an angel. Tell her, I whispered. Hema, tell Sarah I wasn't an angel, just a witness, just someone who remembered. Tell her that was enough. Epilogue in 2015, Sarah Goldstein died peacefully in her home in Haifa, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Her family found among her possessions a carefully preserved letter from an American soldier named David Rosenberg, dated 1985, telling her that hope was an act of defiance. At her funeral, her daughter read from that letter, spoke about how her mother had built a life of teaching and kindness from the ruins of childhood trauma, how she'd named her daughters after women who'd saved her, how she'd passed forward the lesson that safety was something you created, not something you waited for. Sarah's great-grandson, speaking at the funeral, said something that would have made both Sarah and David proud. My great-grandmother taught us that witnessing is sacred work, that remembering is resistance, that building life after destruction is the ultimate victory. She was 6 years old when the Americans liberated Dachau. She was 91 when she died, having lived a life of purpose and meaning. That lifespan, from child in a death camp to great-grandmother in a free country, that's the answer to the Nazis. That's how we win. We survive, we build, we remember, we pass it forward. The story of Dachau's liberation isn't just about April 29, 1945. It's about what came after, about survivors who rebuilt, about witnesses who testified, about the next generation that learned and remembered. It's about Mordechai teaching mathematics to Israeli students, passing knowledge forward because education was resistance. It's about Dr. Fischer healing bodies and minds, using medicine as an act of defiance against death. It's about Jacob prosecuting war criminals, using law as a tool of justice. It's about Sarah teaching kindergarten, showing frightened children that safety exists, and it's about David Rosenberg, the interpreter who carried their words, who translated their testimony, who bore witness to both atrocity and survival, who spent 60 years telling the world what he'd seen because someone had to remember. The war ended in 1945, but the work of bearing witness never ends. Each generation must learn, must remember, must choose to honor the victims by ensuring history doesn't repeat. That's the interpreter's war, not fought with weapons, but with words. not won through violence, but through memory, not ending when soldiers go home, but continuing through every retelling, every testimony, every act of remembrance. David Rosenberg was the interpreter who stayed, who witnessed, who remembered, who passed it forward. That was his service. That was his sacrifice. That was his victory. And now, through this telling, it's ours to carry forward. Remember, don't forget, gedenk, farges nicht.